Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, March 27th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And of course, as always, before we dive into the meat, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and we're able to keep it free because we rely on the support of amazing individuals just like you. If you would like to pledge your support of the show on an episodic basis and find out what perks you might get, like ad-free episodes, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. All right, what do we have on deck for you today? Oh, it's a really good one. So I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Brian Lowery. He's a professor of organizational behavior at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. And other than his academic publications, he's also been featured in outlets that you know and love, like The Washington Post, Psychology Today, Quartz, Pacific Standard, even NPR's All Things Considered. And he hosts the podcast Know What You See. He has a brand new book. It's called Selfless, The Social Creation of You. So without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Brian Lowery. Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to talk about your new book, Selfless, The Social Creation of You. And more than that, just to talk about social psychology, to talk about being a human being in a social milieu. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to talk about being a human being.
And so first, let's talk about you as a human being before we get into the greater kind of conversation about being a human being. So you are, you're at Stanford, right? And you're actually a professor in the School of Business, but you're trained as a social psychologist, which kind of makes sense, but also might be confusing to some people.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess it can be confusing if people expect business schools to only be about how to get more out of your workforce or make more money. It's the business school at Stanford is really, I think, a social science school. And given what I do, I think about people, and it turns out that there are people in businesses. So there you go.
I love that. And you did your graduate degrees at UCLA?
That's right. I got my PhD at UCLA. Uh-huh.
Yay. I'm not a native Angelino, but I got there as soon as I could. I grew up in Texas, and I did my undergrad and master's in Texas, moved to New York for a year, and then came out to LA. And I've lived there for the last 15 years, actually. I'm only randomly in Florida right now for 1 year because, as you know, for clinical psychology, you're required to do an internship. And I ended up matching at a university out here in Florida. And it has been, we'll probably use this as an anchor for some of our conversation, a wildly different experience doing therapy in Florida than it was doing therapy in Los Angeles. Wildly different.
Wow. And where did you study in LA?
So I actually study at a school called Fielding, which is technically in Santa Barbara, but it's distributed, so a lot of it's online. So we have students from all over the country. We meet in Santa Barbara like a few times a year, but my cohort is sort of all over the country.
I see. So Santa Barbara to Florida. Wow. And where in Florida are you?
I'm in Fort Lauderdale, which is, if you got to be in Florida, it's a good place to be, but it's definitely been a culture shock, I have to say.
I can only imagine.
Yeah. So you, of course, trained in social psychology, of course, are in a business school, but obviously bringing all of that important social psychology insight into both your academic work, but also your teaching and your training of the next generation. I'm curious, before we even dive into the book, what was your PhD research on? What were you interested in when you were a graduate student?
So nowadays, everybody knows the term. I don't know everybody, but a lot of people have heard the term implicit bias. So I assume you've heard that term.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that stuff was not mainstream when I was in graduate school. It was just, it was relatively new in social psychology. If people are nerdy, it came from cognitive psychology, this idea of just cognitive associations, and it moved into social psychology as associations between social groups and people's thoughts about social groups. So it was a way of assessing attitudes, like what associations do I make between particular social groups and the ideas of good or bad or particular beliefs about people. And that work assumed that those associations, of which there were many and they were easy to measure, were a reflection of the broader society. So you just were born into the society, you were bombarded by these associations just as a matter of living your life in that society, and that those associations were therefore strong and not particularly malleable. And my research looked at the possibility that relationships could affect those associations, even though they existed to some extent below the threshold of consciousness. So this is a long answer, but the idea was that to engage with someone, to be in a relationship with someone, requires you to share their beliefs. So if you believe that someone is against, say, racism, then even at a non-conscious level, you would become less racist. That's the simplest way to say it. And so we demonstrated, and in my work, I kind of demonstrated that these associations could change as a function of who was standing in front of you, even though you didn't know they were changing. So that's what I
And
worked
like,
on.
how empowering, just even a message and a thought and a finding that individuals who are sort of doing the work when it comes to racial identity development and who are actively on that, we talk about like all of the different researchers involved, and like, we've talked a lot on the show about like Beverly Tatum's book and the analogies that she's used, and also just kind of the specific individuals working within social and even really clinical psychology on race, that as you kind of move through these levels or these stages of racial identity development, very often it can feel a little bit lonely. Like, hopefully you're doing it within a community, but maybe you're doing it as a response to a way that you were raised, or as a response to a wrong that you feel personally that you want to right, or whatever. It's just your own path and your own journey. But how empowering to know that kind of following this moral compass and doing what you think is good for you and eventually, hopefully, good for society actually does have an impact, because the people that you are around are actually measurably affected by you.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the things I find so incredible is how attuned we are and sensitive we are to the people around us, how much they shift who we are. And that's in large part what the book is about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one thing that I think I didn't really get until I got into the clinical side of psychology, because my background was psych and philosophy, and then I did a master's in neurobio, and I got really heavy into the brain, and neuropsychology, and sort of like what's happening in this very, of course, Western American view that's like rugged individualism, and like, how do we measure a person? And like, so often, even in existential psychology, or existential philosophy, unfortunately, we're very often looking at the person as a function of like their own internal life, and wildly ignoring the fact that we are a social species. Like, we don't exist except in relation to other people. We can't. Our own concept of self comes from how we relate to other people.
Oh, I love that. I love that. That's something that I take really seriously. And what's interesting is when people will say that, but haven't really played out what that means. To say that we only exist as selves in the context of relationships, those relationships create us. And I think that people don't take that seriously enough, because if you believe that, it's not just that you're created by the relationships around you, your family and your friends and your romantic partners, or the people that are close to you. It's Also the people that you bump into on the street, that barista at a coffee shop, the checkout person at the grocery store. And I think that what people also miss is that means that you are constructing other people, that you are who they are. And
You're so right. That's the part. I mean, I miss that constantly. Like, it's so, I want to say easy for me to see how readily shaped I am by my culture and my society. And again, like you said, sort of my kinship relationships, my familial relationships, my romantic relationships, even like the books I read, the things I watch on TV, the things I come across in social media. And I so forget that I am also an actor in this milieu and that like people are affected by me. And maybe that's a self-esteem problem. I'm not really sure why it is that for some of us it's so hard to remember that we have an impact too.
And here's the thing that's, I think, also missed. When you have an impact, the question becomes, what's your responsibility? What's our responsibility to each other in a world in which we believe that we are creating each other in every interaction we have?
Right. And so how do you, I mean, gosh, there's so much that you have to grapple with in your work, but of course your work affects, well, maybe it's the other way around. It's so hard to know. It's probably both, right? A two-way street. Your work affects how you think about yourself and how you exist in the world and vice versa. I mean, there's so much nuance. There are so many specific components to this. And so I'm curious, even when you sit down to write a book like Selfless, like where do you begin and what is your ultimate hope?
That's a good question. My ultimate hope, I think, is that people let the book wash over them and that the world is a bigger place at the end. That's my ultimate hope. One of the things that is hard about being a psychologist is that everyone's a psychologist. By that I mean,
Right?
everyone interacts with other people. Everyone has a theory about how people are and what they do, and these beliefs. And you compare that to the hard sciences, where if you're not a physicist, you don't think you know anything about physics. If you're not a geologist, you don't think you know anything about the development of the Earth. And you can be interested in those things as a way of just expanding your knowledge of the world. You can be in awe of quantum mechanics or in awe of the way that mountains develop and erode and what that reveals about the nature of the world. But in psychology, sometimes people, I think, don't allow themselves to be awed by the human experience. And what I wanted to do in the book was actually approach it more like a science book, unless it's not intended as self-help. It's intended to allow you to see yourself and other people in the world in a different way that opens it for you, that allows you to be awed by the possibility of being human.
Mm, I love that so much. I think something that I've been grappling with personally as I, continue on my life journey. I feel like COVID has really affected, like COVID, not me getting COVID last week, but COVID as a global pandemic within the last 3 years has really affected me a lot. The work that I do working in end of life and patients with cancer, my own grapplings with cancer, and also just like I'm turning 40 this year. And I
Congratulations.
am, thank you. Thank you very much. And I am a single woman in the world. I consider myself to be a somewhat successful single woman. I choose to be single. I'm actually ethically non-monogamous. I have a kind of non-traditional lifestyle that baffles some of my friends and family, but that I am always sort of trying to educate people about. And as all of these different parts of my intersectionality, my atheism, my whiteness, my femininity, my Latina-ness, all of these things I sort of grapple with. One thing that I find keeps floating to the top for me is this idea that we as a people so often are afraid to like love and to love like vulnerably and openly, that we protect love as if it's some sort of precious commodity that can only be shared in very specific situations. And I don't know, lately my life has been sort of driven by this idea that like, I want to love and be loved as often as I possibly can because that is why I'm here.
I love that. I think maybe the desire to, and this is, I'm just speculating here, but maybe the desire to protect love as this precious, fragile thing is really more a desire to protect the self. And by that, I mean, if you accept that, again, people create us, and there's research that suggests that people can take people into themselves literally, meaning that yourself can become enmeshed with other people's selves, that maybe there's some fear around that, right? That is, as you become enmeshed with someone else, the idea that could be broken or even enlarged is frightening because it requires something of you, that it changes who you are.
Right.
Maybe
Or that you
that's
even lose yourself.
exactly. I think there's a lot of that happens, and not just in love, but I'm going to go on a slight tangent. You think about things like transgenderism, immigration. I see a connection in terms of like responses to those, like negative responses, as being about a maintenance of how I see myself and who I am, right? If I'm a citizen of the United States and immigrants come in and start to, in my mind, change what it means to be an American citizen, what does that mean about me, who I am? If I define myself as a woman or a man and someone comes along and challenges the way I understand that identity, what does that mean about me? So this idea that we can just allow people to be who they are in a way that doesn't affect us misses the communal nature of identity. Like,
What an
identities are not
important
individual things, they're
insight.
communal.
Yeah. And like, I think so often, because obviously I am like wildly progressive and liberal and like, I try my best, especially as now as a therapist, to champion the rights and the identities and offer affirmative care for all of my clients of every walk of life. It's a passion of mine deeply, but you do see very often that even on like in the most progressive and liberal arguments, this kind of like, what is it to you if so and so is going to be who they are? It doesn't affect you. But like what you're saying is it does affect somebody's core concept of identity, and probably a better way to work towards an egalitarian, accepting, beautiful future is to accept that oneself is defined by the selves of the many. And so we do need to grapple with these core concepts and why they feel threatening to some people.
100%. I think that was well said. I think, and on some level, we do understand that. I consider myself very liberal and progressive too, and I want to respect everyone's sense of themselves and engage with the person in the way they want to be seen and who they want to be. But and when you think about, I'll stay with transgenderism for just a second. It still is a desire to be something understandable in society. And it may not be what people label you as. You might say that's wrong, but it's not as if it's a elimination of a social identity. It's just a claim being made on an existing social identity. And I think sometimes we miss that part of it, right? That it's not, even when you make that claim, it's not really an individualistic claim. It's a communal claim. You want people to treat you in accordance with an identity that they understand and that you understand.
Right. And that's where I think you do see these like complicated and difficult upcroppings of, concepts like what turfism, like trans exclusionary radical feminism, where the intersectionality of one person and the intersectionality of another person, they're having a hard time coming to terms with how your identity and my identity can coexist in a way that I feel, I don't know, inclusive and accepting, and still kind of have ownership over who I consider myself to be. It's a fascinating psychological concept. I mean, it's terrible, but it's also really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to transition a little bit because you mentioned your ethical non-monogamy. That's something you practice,
Yes.
E&M. Like, I'm
Mhm.
surprised actually that people that it's not gotten more backlash than it has. It seems like, and maybe this is the milieu
I
I
think it's
live
because we're
in.
still pretty quiet about it. I don't know. I feel like it's still not socially acceptable to even talk about it.
I know. But I guess like this is again, like this is probably the milieu I live in. That's not, I mean, I'm like, yeah, I hear that discussed, and maybe
Right.
it's not mainstream enough to have generated a hot enough backlash yet. But I'm curious about that because I do feel like it's and again, I don't have any statistics on this, but I feel like it's growing as a possibility that people can see and understand and engage with. And I'm curious how that's going to evolve. And actually, for you, I'm curious how people respond because you're obviously very open about it.
Right. And I think I've only been more and more open about it recently. And I've definitely found that it runs the gamut, right? There are the people who really get it and try their best to support it, or they just naturally do find it curious and fascinating and interesting and they want to engage on it and talk about it. Or there's the people who are like, yeah, me too. I just didn't know I had the label for it. And then there's the people in my life who are some of my closest friends who I consider to be incredibly progressive, incredibly open-minded, who just cannot get past some of the social norms that, and I see this purely as a function of normativity, right? Like they're just like, I think it's really in some ways the last frontier of normativity is like, single partner nesting, marriage, children, that these are the moralistic goals that we are all supposed to. I mean, it's the only thing, we're literally the only thing we're taught. And I think in some ways even worse so for women, but clearly it's all men are taught too, in at least in our society. And when I say our society, I mean the West, which of course is ethnocentric and monocultural, and there are a million societies within our society. But I do find that a lot of people, when I try to explain to them things like compersion, which is like sort of the opposite of jealousy, it's like delighting in the fact that your partner is getting their needs met, or just different concepts of ethical non-monogamy, they just like, there's a moralistic kind of pushback to it that somehow, oh, well, you just are bad at commitment, or you just don't want the same thing, and it's like, no, I've actually thought about this stuff.
Uh-huh.
I love it. I love engaging on it philosophically because I think that it really is still one of these places where I can confront people's implicit biases in a deep way. And they can really start to question the nature of their reality and what they, the milieu that they were raised in. But at the same time, I do find that there's still a lot of pushback, even from people that I love. And they're happy for me, but I still get this like vibe like they're judging me. Like something recently that happened where I was invited to a wedding and I was like, can I bring so-and-so? And they were like, oh, I don't know if I can do a +1. And I was like, but what about so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so? They all have yeah, but those are their wives and husbands. And it's like, how is this any different? Because I didn't engage in that. I'm somehow treated as though my relationship is not as serious or is not as important when, like, I was like, you're friends with this partner of mine. You don't even know that person's husband. Like, I don't understand the reasoning. So yeah, things like that happen. And it's curious to me.
And to what extent do you think it's about not necessarily judgment of morality, but more a fear that it's a indictment of their choices?
Yeah, I think that's probably a part of it because I think in some ways I'm unapologetic about indicting their choices.
So you're judging them. I just want to be clear here.
And that's the thing. I don't think it's that I'm ever, and again, like it's interesting because it's not individualistic, like you mentioned. Obviously, my best friend and her husband I love to death, and they just had a baby, and they're my favorite people in the world. And I think it's amazing that they're together. But the institution of marriage, the expectation of a woman entering into a man's financial security domain, and the undermining of that of me being a single woman in my late 30s who owns her own home, who is like, no, I'm not going to give up my house for some relationship. Like those kinds of indictments I am very public about because they're very like deep in my feministic self. So it's fascinating. You're right that I could see people being like, wait, you're pushing back against what I think. is right or true or works for me. And I'm like, no, I'm pushing back against that being the normative. I think it's great for you. I hate that it's expected that it's the case for everybody.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think it's hard for people maybe to make that distinction.
Right. Right. And it's, so much of everything that matters in the world is nuance and context, right? Yet we are a society and a culture that wants like the 5-second soundbite, that doesn't want to ever change our minds, that, it's like the very fundamental things about science that make science beautiful. Obviously there's a lot of things that make science awful, but the things about science that make it beautiful are like in direct contradiction to the things that make our political system, quote unquote, work. So I talk about this all the time, this idea that in science, we're constantly changing our minds when we find out new things and we're constantly questioning our biases, or at least that's the goal. Whereas in politics, you've got to be like, this is what I want. It's what I'll always want. I'm never going to change my mind. And that's what we actually promote as somehow better.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know why that is, but even there, things change. They just change differently, right? So it's more cataclysmic changes or paradigm shifts, right? So you think about gay marriage. I think of that as like a huge paradigm shift that happened relatively quickly. When everyone was against it, and then all of a sudden things turn, and I don't know if everyone's for it, but it becomes somehow accepted. I find it fascinating when that happens.
Right. It's sort of the example of that I have often been pointed to is after the war, when the UK first started the National Health Service, and people were really against it the way that they were here in the US. Like there was a lot of pushback against, do we want a single payer system? Do we want to have, universal health care? And then once it was implemented out of a time of strife and kind of necessity, and people got used to it and accustomed to it, now it's like anathema to talk about not having it. Like, it's like, no, you can't take away national health care. Are you kidding me? It's just so fundamental to what it means to be a citizen. And it's fascinating how that works, how quickly, and this is a social psychology concept, right? Like, I'm sure there's a name for this, how quickly we adjust and adapt to certain parameters in our life and how hard it is to think about going back to the way things were before.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's the shifting norms are, I find, because that those examples, that the to some extent gay marriage, to a larger extent socialized medicine in the UK, it's like policy shifts have a huge effect, and sometimes in ways that we can't see, and once things change, they just, I feel like, just shift really quickly. Like a great example is cigarette smoking in the United States, right? There was a time when if you weren't a smoker, that was, too bad for you. And the smokers were the ones who had the rights. Like if you didn't like it, you could go outside. And then it shifted. And then all of a sudden, if you're a smoker, that's so fine for you. Just find some place to smoke. Where whose preferences mattered, right? What were the norms around it just shifted radically. And there, you just see it was in large part like you can't smoke inside anymore. And that was enough over time to just completely shift the norms.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's so fascinating. And I even I feel like I have a personal experience with that because I was a smoker back in the day. I'm a non-smoker now. And how quickly almost my own personal judgment shifted. Because when I was a smoker, I was really self-righteous about my rights as a smoker and everybody's trying to get in my way. And then, of course, as soon as I was a non-smoker and I could see the other side of that coin, I'm like disgusted when I'm walking down the street and I smell, oh, I can't believe that person would smoke a cigarette that close to a building, or, oh my God, is somebody smoking inside? How dare they? It's so fascinating how being in these different groups, it's so hard to see outside of the group. It's hard to see outside of one's own ideology.
Yeah, it is. I think that's obviously right now in terms of political polarization, a huge issue, right? Because it's almost like when you live in different worlds, and this comes up all the time in politics, people have a different set of facts. It's not just like, yeah, we all agree this is happening. We just think about it differently. It's like, no, it's so powerful that we don't even agree on sometimes basic facts.
Mm-hmm. Ugh, I mean, and it's like I'm curious, you have a lot of expertise in this area, and you within a sort of a business department are talking about real world manifestations of these things, and you're not just studying it from a dispassionate, curious, separate kind of perch. You're also saying, what can we do about this? Like, how can we affect change? And I'm just like, do you constantly feel disempowered? How do you do your job?
Like, how do I take it?
Right.
I'll just say I'm not the most optimistic person you'll ever meet. But my attitude toward this is there are things you care about in the world. And if you care deeply enough, there are things worth engaging with. And they're worth engaging with not because you know you're going to change them. They're worth engaging with because you care deeply about them, and that's enough. I think we have our time here on Earth, and we live in a certain milieu that happens to be our historical moment. And I think you do your best to engage in that moment, in the time you're here. And whether or not you shift it or the world becomes closer to the world you'd like it to be is of secondary importance. I think that's the part that might be weird. The important thing, the thing of primary importance, I think, is that you engage.
And the cool thing is that your own research has shown that in some ways, even that secondary thing will sort of definitionally it will fundamentally shift because of your authenticity within the world. Like, this is something that kind of comes to the heart of the psychotherapeutic work that I'm often doing with clients, especially older adults and end of life clients, is this deep exploration of, how do I spend my life? Do I spend my life bending to the expectations and the normativity of the culture, the society, the family, the whatever that I grew up with in an effort to sort of present a self to the world that is acceptable, that is okay, and then receive the love that I receive that is maybe somewhat conditional on my ability to present this idealized self, or, and maybe it's not an either or, it's usually somewhere in between. Do I deeply tap into what it means to be an authentic self, to be true to myself, whatever that means, knowing that some people are not going to like me, knowing that I'm going to have some sort of negative backlash, but that the true connections that I have potentially will have more depth, potentially will have greater meaning and purpose. I think that this is a lifelong struggle for like everybody on the planet.
Mm-hmm. There's something that I've been lately talking a lot about. There's a professor at now Chicago, Professor Oishi, who has this paper on psychological richness, which I love. And in the
Oh, I
book,
love that construct,
yes,
psychological richness. What a
yes,
great, oh God, that's perfect wording.
yes. And I have a chapter in my book on the experience of meaning in life. And so this is something I think about a lot. And in his paper, Professor Oishi, he talks about these three ways you can think about a good life. And two are well known and have come down through Aristotle thousands of years, and we still talk about. And one is also been talked about, but is kind of lost. It's not talked about that much in contemporary literatures, and this is what he's pushing. So the three ways that you can think about a good life are hedonic, which just means more pleasure than pain. Try to minimize pain, you maximize pleasure. Safety, security, all these things are hedonic. There's eudaimonic, which is what most people think about as a meaningful life, right? Are you in service of other people? Do you have goals to change the world in some way that's aligned with, say, your moral view, the universe? And the third one he calls psychological richness, which is exploring different experiences that shift your perspective on the world. And I think what you're describing is that people are afraid of challenging norms and being outside of the mainstream. A lot of that, I think, is about this sense of hedonism. And that word usually means something like going out and having this fun time, but really it's a fear of pain or discomfort. of being excluded, right? It's a desire for safety and security, for comfort. And that can be sometimes at odds with something like psychological richness, which is what I hear kind of in our conversation. I hear you talking about, like, I want to have this rich life. I want to have these different experiences. I don't want to be limited by accepted norms and practices. I want to explore the world, right? That is about psychological richness. And so I just like to think about, how are you living? What is guiding the way you live? What are you striving to have in the time you have on the earth, right? What do you value? And what are you willing to risk in service of that?
It's fascinating because I'm making a connection. I don't know if it's 100% valid in my mind, but in the work that I've been doing on my dissertation, it's sort of a qualitative um, exploration of the experience of individuals who are choosing to die with medical aid. And so sort of asking them questions about why they're making this decision, what has worked for them, what hasn't, what's been easy, what's been difficult. And what I found is so fascinating in doing my literature review is that when you ask most doctors, or just, the lay public, why do people choose medical aid in dying? They always cite physical suffering. They always say people want to hasten their death because they are afraid of dying in pain. But when you ask the people themselves who choose medical aid in dying, overwhelmingly, it's about existential suffering. It's about feeling like they're a burden. It's about feeling like they've lost purpose and meaning. It's about feeling like their time is complete and there's no reason left. And it's not really about the physical pain, because their physical pain is either somewhat well managed with palliative drugs, or it's just not out in front of everything else. And I find that that's a fascinating disconnect where we tend, I think, to idealize, or we tend to have these mental expectations, especially when it comes to things like end of life, where the stakes are really, really high, of what is. And then when we actually get into the weeds of what actually is, it's not the same. Like this idea of hedonism versus, this meaning and purpose, or this psychological, what did he call it? Psychological what was richness. Like sometimes for people, it's that they're done. There's no more psychological richness. And that is more painful than physical pain.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, like, what are we living for? Right? And if you take that away from someone, I mean, it's not unreasonable. They would say, then I don't have this, then I'm happy to end my time on the earth.
Right. And it also becomes a fascinating, I guess, and a little bit more fraught conversation if we're looking at people who died by suicide, and we're looking at those who actually did leave behind some sort of note or some sort of explanation. What was it that ultimately whether it was real or not, they felt to be true, that kind of initiated or exacerbated whatever they were dealing with? And very often, I think it's a loss of purpose. You see that the rates go up after unemployment, after tragic deaths, after divorce, after, all these different reasons. And those are anchor points for people for purpose and meaning.
And I also feel like people lose a sense of themselves, right? Especially when someone close to you dies. Like, there's um, a way in which you literally have lost a piece of yourself. And I mean, you could ask, like, how much of that can one person manage? I think that's a reasonable question.
Right. And you see that, of course, with so much psychological trauma, whether we're talking about sexual assault, where there's a loss of some sense of self, or whether it's individuals, with complex PTSD who have just had so many losses over their lives. How does that actually affect their own fundamental sense of self? And then, of course, there's this larger question of what some people would point to as the scariest prospect. And it's the stuff of, The Last of Us, like this TV show that everybody's so into on HBO, which, by the way, was amazing. but it's the stuff of zombie films, and it's also the stuff of, sadly, the true horrors and sufferings of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, things of that nature, losing your sense of self.
Yeah. I mean, one of the papers that I have looks at this concept called self-continuity, the degree to which you can connect your present self to a future self, and how that plays a role in creating a sense of meaning in life.
Wow,
Um,
I love that. Oh, it's
yeah,
fascinating and probably so fundamental.
yeah, and so when that is broken, it's going to be, um, at the very least, somewhat painful and certainly discombobulating, right? Like it's hard to understand where you are in the moment without some sense of what the future might be, or that you'll be there in the future. And there's also a lot of work. I assume you've seen some of this work that people have a hard time with the concept that they will cease to exist.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, then it's important when we're looking at things like fear of death. I read a lot of Yalom. I'm very existential, so fear of death is an important part of my work. And it's fascinating that we often take for granted that fear of death is one thing, but it's so many different things to different people. For some people, it's fear of not existing. For other people, it's fear of loss. For other people, it's fear of a lack of finishing what they started. Or, there's so many different reasons that people fear death. And yeah, this concept of non-existence for some people is like incredibly psychologically terrifying.
Do you know this work on terror management theory? Have you read that?
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I thought you might. So what I find interesting is that even people that don't report a fear of death, like when reminded of death, still cling to things that they're connected to that will live on beyond them. So, for example, if you are connected to being a citizen of America, if you feel like a patriot, when people remind you of death, whether it's on purpose or you just drive past the cemetery, your connection to the symbols of America grows stronger. And the claim is that it's because your connection to America will allow you to live on through America even after you are dead. Can you see, and also people with money buying buildings, and there's all these ways in which people seek this symbolic immortality.
And it's fascinating because it in and of itself taps back into the very sort of larger arguments or themes of your book, that to exist as a self is not to exist individually, it's to exist connected to so many other selves, and to define ourselves by those other selves that we overlap with. And it's the same thing when the self ceases to exist in life, because we are hoping, we are determined that our legacy be carried on by other selves.
Yeah, what I find amazing is that cognitively, people feel like they're this individual, most at least in the West, right? I'm this island unto myself that decides to interact with other people or not. But when you look at some of the ways that human beings behave, it suggests that's not true at all. Like, and this is just one example where the way people deal with fear of death is by relying on the way they are connected to and defined by things that are outside of them, by other relationships, by communities they belong to. And I find that really compelling and really interesting that we can have this story we tell ourselves about our individual existence, but then still behave in ways that reflect an understanding on some level that we exist in communities as a member of a community.
It's interesting that, like, I feel like that very concept is highlighted so well by the phenomenon that is social media and the social currency that comes along with social media, that there's this community online that's made up of individual people who are really experiencing a deep sense of validation, purpose, self from the number of thumbs up and hearts and likes from other individuals within that same community, offering instantaneous feedback. You're accepted. You're part of the tribe. You're somebody that I want to make space for in my life. And it's sort of this like commodification, or maybe even just like gamification of these very human concepts that always existed, but are now sort of like on steroids and so much more explicit to us in this kind of funhouse social media experience. I'm curious about like your take on social media just in general.
Yeah, I also have actually a chapter on this in the book, which is that in a paper about this. I think you're right that it taps into some basic human need, right, for validation, for connection. That we are social beings, and it takes advantage of that. And I also think that the way it plays out, though, is really interesting. And the argument that I make in the paper I wrote about it is that it might stunt our ability to help have ourselves evolve. And I'll give an example. Just think about the number of selfies that people take. Like it's how many memories you capture in ways that don't allow your thoughts about them maybe to evolve the way they would have been if they weren't, captured in this amber. Right. And you can see, especially if you started when you were really young, all of what you've done in the past in a way that doesn't allow forgetting, perhaps. And forgetting is maybe a necessary part of evolution. Right. So that's one example of how the use of social media and the collection of all these, these pieces of our past might be affecting how ourselves develop. And then the
It's
other
also
thing, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Can please hold the second thought though, because I don't want to lose it. Okay. So the reason I interjected is because I just got back from a trip to Jordan with a group of psychology students where I'm doing my internship, a couple professors, a couple postdocs, myself, and then a bunch of what we call trainees, so second, third, and fourth year graduate students. And one of the things that I noticed, which was wildly different between the older sort of cohort and the younger cohort, was we would go to these incredible places, Petra, the Citadel, Mount Nebo, that were like stunning and breathtaking. And I remember at one point I was at the Citadel and I was in front of this, ruin, and I picked up my camera to take a photo, and 5 people were like, go ahead. You want to get in? I'll take it for you. And I was like, I don't want a photo of myself. I want a photo of the ruin. I was like, I want you to get out of the shot so that I can actually see. And it was amazing to see how many of these students didn't seem to be interested in reading about the history, didn't seem to be interested in sitting and experiencing the awe of these are places that are so old. We're talking, there was Paleolithic and then Byzantine and then, Jewish and Christian and Muslim history, and all in the same place. This is history, just like, oh, it's so much. I can't even put it into words. And yet it's like, look, selfie, look, here I am in front of the thing. And it just baffled me. And I don't know if that's a generational difference or if it's a personality difference or if that's actually a cultural, I don't know what you call it, grooming. I don't know. But exactly what you're talking about, this idea, I see it as like a fragmentation. Not only can they not forget, but their memory is this like isolationist memory of like my face with this background, not of this background becoming a foreground in my life. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm grappling with this thought as I verbalize.
Yeah. No, I do that all the time. I think while I talk.
Right.
I think that maybe, and I don't know. I assume it's somewhat generational. I think, and I'll speak from my experience. I feel like when I had experiences in the past, I experienced them with the people with me. So that kind of was the community. There was no way to, when I was young, to bring along everybody I know to this experience with me. But now in a way they can, right? It's as if they're saying like, I want everyone to experience this with me. And the only way I can do that is by being in it, I guess literally and metaphorically in the picture too. It's like, otherwise I'm just showing them pictures of my vacation, but they're not doing it with me.
Oh my gosh. So I love that so much. And like how glass half full of you.
I'm very proud of myself because that's not.
What a beautiful conceptualization, honestly, because it's so easy for us to become really cynical when it comes to these very concepts like social media. Oh, it's detrimental and it's tearing us apart, but it is bringing us together in so many ways. And I think both of those things can be true at the same time.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I mean, it's complex, right? Just like anything that's worth talking about. It's
Yeah.
complex.
Okay, so you put a pin in something because I totally interrupted
No,
you.
no,
The
no
second
worries.
thing.
The second thing is the algorithms. This is, I feel like it has dampened serendipity. So we've given over to an algorithm and the companies that create these algorithms, the discovery, like the ability or the process of discovery we've handed over. And I get it because it's more efficient, right? So if I'm on, whatever it is, Spotify or Amazon or whatever, any of these platforms that have algorithms that make recommendations to me, I love the recommendations. I love them because people like me like them, right? That's what they're designed on, my past experience and other people that share that kind of experience. And they're giving me things that I like. But the problem is there might be things that are vastly different than what I already know and like that I would love as well. And I don't know how to have that serendipity. Like going into a record store and flipping through albums is vastly different than having someone tell you, you're going to like this album. And I get it. I love having the recommendations. So I'm not anti the recommendations. They're great. And sometimes it's fun and useful just to spend time in a bookstore looking at a bunch of books that you can't stand to find the one that you'd never expected to love.
Ugh. And it's like, I mean, the parallel I see, of course, is with dating apps. It's like these dating apps work so hard to use these algorithms. And yes, you can connect with people so readily, like, oh, you're 5 minutes away from me and we have similar interests and we're both atheists and we both believe, this and that, and we both have these same ideals. And then sometimes you get together and you're like, why is there no chemistry? Like on paper, everything was perfect, but you're not taking the time to talk to somebody that maybe they weren't checking all the boxes, but they caught your eye in that very bookstore. They made you feel a certain way in your chest because of the way that they looked at you, and you can't really explain it. And those very deeply human experiences, and again, that capacity for love, like, is love something that we should be calculating all the time? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. And this is where I try not to be judgmental about it because look, the reality is you have to go through a lot to find that person, right? And so someone could argue that it's true that you don't have that human touch and selection, but it's also true that you're much more likely to find that with one of the people I present to you than if you just go out on the street and randomly try to run
Right.
into them. That's also true, right?
Right. Yeah,
So,
it's the good and the bad. And of
yeah.
course, I would take that even a step further with my E&Mness that like it's hard to find that one person. I don't think one person can be anything to all people. So it's like it's hard to find those features of those multiple people.
Good luck, Roy.
Yeah.
I love your optimism though. I really do. I appreciate that.
Yeah, gosh, and there's so much, I mean, there's so much more. Like I'm thinking we put a pin in a few things. I'm looking at how you divided your book, like starting with you and yourself, then you and them, then you and everything. This idea of, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but this idea of like sort of the Western independent individuality, separateness, and really that concept, it doesn't stand because it doesn't truly exist. It's a construct of how we make sense of the world, right? It's a pattern recognition. It's a categorization that we use. It's a shorthand tool that we use. But ultimately, we are simply because of how we relate to the immediate and the larger.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's like when there's a quote that's like I think it's a Zulu phrase. It's like I am because we are. Um, and I think that the individual self. I agree. I don't think that captures the reality, but I think there are places and ways in which it's a useful fiction. right? And I think I think it's hard to push people to give it up, and that's not really the goal. But I do want to challenge people to think about another possibility. What if the way the world appears to you is not quite right? Like, what does that open? And this is why I say it's not self help, because I'm always loath to tell people what to do. Like, how do I know? Who am I to tell somebody what to do and how to live? But I do think I can offer alternative ways to see the world that allows you to make different types of decisions, that both opens the world and just the beauty of what it can be, and then to the extent that it's useful, right? That it increases your range, it increases what you can do, it makes choices more meaningful, right? In that you see the possibilities.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that I would be remiss if I didn't tap into before we sort of close things up. And I was thinking about this early on when we were talking. I volunteered throughout this conversation some aspects of my own intersectionality that I think are very defining and that are guiding for me. But you, as the author of this book, you as the researcher and professor within this kind of world, I'm curious about your own, if to what extent you're comfortable, your own sort of intersectionality has brought certain biases into play, has sort of shaped the way that you think about self, because yourself is made up of a lot of different concepts of self.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I'm a Black man. I'm a professor at Stanford, and a number of other things like partner, brother, you know, uncle, blah blah blah. I um, and I don't know how true this is, but I'll just say what my experience is. For most of my life, I felt like people had a hard time understanding me in totality, right? So in our society, me being a Black man is not really compatible with me being a professor at Stanford. Um, when I was in grad school, this is a strange story. I used to knit. And so I'd be this young Black guy, like knitting at the airport. And it was just so strange just how people responded to that. It's just like trying to make sense of it because it didn't fit their conception of what I was or should be. And even prior to that, like in high school, I moved around a lot. And so I saw um, different life circumstances, and I saw people, and in particular kids, life circumstances being dictated by the environments they were in. And I've always been fascinated by that. Um, what determines our life outcomes? Um, how do we end up where we are? And I feel incredibly lucky in my life. I feel like I've been, by many people's standards, like successful. Um, and I feel like I worked hard. I feel like, yeah, I'm smart. And those things are not enough to generate the life I have. This is what it is, right? Like, I also feel like that it also required an incredible amount of luck and all of the people I interacted with that influenced me, that allowed me to be where I am. Like, I have a deep appreciation for both the serendipity and luck and the contribution of so many people to the life I live, that it's hard for me to think in terms of just me. I did this. I am this. And it's hard for me to see other people in that way, that they're just them and they did this. And all of it is driven by some kind of ineffable, essential soul that's driving their life to where it is. Like, I just don't, it's hard to see the world that way, given my experience.
Right. And whether these forces have been, if we wanted to put some sort of valence on them, whether they have been helpful and beneficial and loving and nurturing, or whether they have actually been cold and cruel and distant, those are still forces of society, of individual people that do shape us. We are still affected by whether it be trauma or nurturing. And I think that the narrative that we sometimes struggle with, or at least I do, is that I tend to fall back on an individualist view because I tend to feel sometimes alone in my hacking my way through life. And I think for people who don't feel like they have a lot of community or a lot of support, or maybe we just, we do, but only in certain aspects, or we have a hard time tapping into it at certain times, it can feel very isolating. But that's still a function of the self being co-created.
Indeed. Well, I feel like you're affecting me right now in this conversation. And I know that you have these conversations often. And so I think that an example like feeling alone, that there's a way in which that's never quite right, but it doesn't change the feeling, right? So feelings don't have to reflect some reality. I mean, they're just the experience of that reality, right? And I think sometimes we try to make sense of the feeling by describing the reality in a particular way.
Right. Like we have this cognitive interpretation of a very emotional experience.
Yes. And so I think it's really hard. It's very easy to feel alone. And a lot of people do. And I don't in any way want to minimize the pain of the experience of feeling alone. But the reality is it's really hard to actually be fully alone. And it's a conundrum, right? Because you can be so pained by the feeling of loneliness and still be being shaped so powerfully by all these people around you. And I don't know how to help people tap into the number of people that are around them participating in who they are in ways that could alleviate that painful experience of loneliness.
Well, maybe just the profundity of that very realization, of that very explicit understanding that we are not feral children. Like we literally are shaped by people, everything around us, the institutions, the edifices, the relationship. These are all really, when it comes down to it, it's people. It's all people.
Yes. At the risk of sounding woo-woo, which is, I just want to be clear, you will not get in the book at all if you read the book.
Good. People listening to my show are like, here it comes.
No. I am the furthest from woo you will ever get, I promise.
Same.
But I think it can sound this way because what I'm going to say can sound this way because it's just so different than how we, at least in the West, experience the world. But we are surrounded by and created by an immense swirl of relationships like that. I think that's the reality of what it means to be human. And somehow the story we tell ourselves doesn't allow us to see it clearly, I think. But that idea, I think, can sound woo-woo. That no, and I don't think it is at all. Like, no, we are, I think, quite literally being constructed continuously by the people around us. And what would it mean to explore that possibility, to think about what that looks like, how that's affecting you? And I really do think there's something powerful about reflecting on that as, a possibility. And honestly, I think it's true.
Yeah, I do too. I think there is a we, in a very kind of ultimate sense, there is a we, and reflecting on that and tapping into the awe of that is sort of fundamental to that human experience. I'm curious, Brian. I always close my shows by asking my guests the same two questions. I don't know if I've had somebody on the show whose answers to these questions I'm more like, usually I feel like I can guess how people are going to answer these questions, but with you, I just don't know. So I'm really excited to get to go there with you. And even the way that I caveat the questions and sort of contextualize them taps into so much of what we've been talking about tonight. So they're sort of big picture. Be ready for that. Take as much time as you need. But like, I guess just here we go. I want to know first, And both of these questions can be answered. Here's the caveat part. In whatever context you feel like is relevant. So it could be, again, very personal. It could be, this is so funny to say this to you. It could be familial. It could be communal. It could be societal. It could be global. It could be cosmic. It could be really any context that feels relevant to you in this moment.
I can't wait for this question. This is a lot of caveating.
Right. Number one, what is the thing that's keeping you up the most at night that you're fundamentally and, really authentically concerned about? Maybe you're struggling with some pessimism, even some cynicism. And then on the flip side of that, on a more positive note, where are you finding your hope, your optimism in like a true way?
I'm going to go, I don't know how deeply cynical you you want to go.
As cynical as you want to be.
Pessimistic. I find humanity terrifying. I find individual people incredible. I find human beings terrifying as a collection. So I worry about things like, all sorts of things like democratic government, right? Like, how stable is it? And if what many people call the thin veneer of civilization cracks, what's underneath? I think about that. That's something that for a long time has worried me and continues to worry me. Like, I just have a sense of people are capable of beautiful things, but wow, the things that humans have done to other human beings is terrifying.
And continue to do.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, and even when you look at the past, people are like, we're beyond that. No, I mean, that's those proclivities, those potentials still exist. And that's terrifying, honestly, to me. So that's the thing that kind of worries me most. And then there's, all kinds of like particular manifestations of that, but those are like my biggest concerns, I think. Just a fear of what human beings are capable of and the harm that people are willing to do to each other. So that's that. And then what gives me most hope? Is that the second part of the question?
Yep. What are you optimistic about?
I guess I'm optimistic about the fact that, or made optimistic by the fact that most people want to do, I think, the right thing. And I see the tension, by the way, between my first answer and this one. And I think you have to separate, to make sense of what I'm saying, you have to separate individuals from a collective. And my hope is that somehow that individual desire to be moral, to be good, can be shaped in a way that tames some of the darkness that exists in the collective.
I love this so much. I feel like more than any other guest I've had on the show, you're sort of taking some of my nebulous thoughts and feelings and putting them into really tangible ideas, into words. And I just can't help but feel too, this is so like, sorry, this is so ridiculous, but like, I just finished The Last of Us, and I feel like anybody who's been watching that show and who has really been deeply into it is probably like, oh yes, like everything you're saying right now, if they're contextualizing it against the backdrop of like the narrative arc of that show and or the video game, if you played the video game, because it grapples with these very deep questions of like the intrinsic ability for good and for love and for purpose and meaning and companionship and communion that individual people possess and have shown throughout all of recorded human history, and yet the capability for dark and very deeply problematic, tribalistic, cruel, minimizing, genocidal hatred that we've seen perpetrated. It's just, I mean, I guess it's the stuff of every real poem, of every real song, of every real book, of every real story, is the capacity for a human being to so readily exist on both of those planes.
By the way, I'm embarrassed to say, I don't know, embarrassed, but I have not watched any of.
I hadn't either until I had COVID. You got to do it.
Okay. I hear great things about it.
But what I would recommend doing is watch it. If you're going to watch it, watch the like recap after the show where the writers and the directors really talk about what they were trying to get into, because yes, there are some beautiful themes that, you know, any thinking person is going to pick up, but when you hear them make them explicit, like the grapplings and the morals and the stories, I think there's a whole other level of depth to it. So it's like the analysis portion of the show, I think, is equally meaningful.
Okay, I'll check it out.
Yeah.
You know, I love that you make it sound so compelling, so I can't wait to check it out.
It is. It's actually quite deep. So it's like, oh, wow. Especially for somebody who's very, I think, psychologically minded, because the ultimate, and I won't give any spoilers here, but the ultimate themes have to do with love and companionship and how we think of those as being wholly good, but they can drive people to do things that moralistically are very questionable for the sake of our humanity or for the sake of our love for an individual person. And that push and pull between individuality and individual relationships and these big global holistic societal relationships. There's a grappling there that the show, and I guess the video game too, I never played the game, does a really good job with. So anyway, not to take this away, because I want to come back to the book, everyone, is Selfless, The Social Creation of You by Dr. Brian Lowery. Brian, I can't thank you enough for this super I'm sorry I kept you so long. It was so compelling and meaningful, this conversation. I really do feel like I had a connection during this hour that we spent together that mattered. And gosh, I hope it can continue at some point in the future.
Yeah, I mean, if you're back in LA and I'm down, maybe we can have coffee or something. But the conversation has been incredible. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I really like the questions. I think, it's I like to think of myself when I'm feeling generous toward myself more as an artist than a scientist. And honestly, I think science should be thought of as a bit of art as well. And I like the way you brought in the show, because my goal in the book and in these kind of conversations is to help people think deeply about these broad issues in a way that changes how they think about themselves.
Oh, what a I think beautiful ultimate goal. And I think that, whether it's deeply profound and easy to point to, or it happens in some very, very small way, the good thing is that when somebody engages with this kind of work, it can't not have that effect. And that's what's so beautiful about being human and learning and experiencing ideas. They change us. And then when we are changed, we change the people around us. And
Indeed.
And you have dropped a stone in that water. And so I thank you for sharing with us today and for spending the time with us.
Thank you. And I wish you luck on your journey.
Thanks so much. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.